Rip Van Winkle made its author very famous very fast. His name was Washington Irving, and he grew up in the little towns and villages along the banks of the Hudson River in upper New York State. He wrote about these places in Rip Van Winkle and in his other most famous story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which some people call the Headless Horseman. The fame of these stories brought him great rewards immediately, but interestingly, he had a whole other career. He became a diplomat for the United States government, actually rising to the post of U.S. ambassador to Spain. But even while he was miles and miles away on the other side of the ocean, Washington Irving always longed for his home, and in the end, that's where he went. He went back to the little villages along the Hudson River, and that's where he lived out his life. So famous was he that the people renamed the little village where he settled Irvingtown, and he could look out from his home to the majestic, rolling Hudson and see the largest steamboat in the area going by, and on its stern were painted in large letters the name that he had immortalized with his character, Rip Van Winkle. But I'll let him explain to you. Through the magic of audio recording and your imagination, may I introduce to you Mr. Washington Irving.
This tale was found among the papers of the late Diedrich Knickerbocker, an old gentleman of New York. Mr. Knickerbocker was interested in the history of the New York area under the Dutch settlers and then as an English colony. His method of research was unusual, since he paid little attention to books on the subject. Instead, he preferred, when traveling, to stop into the homes and farms of the local people and ask them for the stories of those parts. He paid particular attention to stories told by the old wives out in the countryside. It was from one of these that he first had this story, the story of Rip Van Winkle.
The story began back in the late 1760s in a sleepy little village among the Catskill Mountains of New York State. Now, in those days, before highways and automobiles, the Catskill Mountains seemed far away from just about everywhere. Oh, they beckoned to travelers journeying up from the city of New York along the mighty Hudson River. But they were still very far inland. The travelers could just see the heavy woods and the great stone cliffs and valleys. Now at the foot of these majestic peaks, where the hazy blue of the heights merged into the lush green meadowlands of the farms below, there sat a sleepy little town. Hardly a town, not even a village, really, more of a bend in the road. And this was the home of Rip Van Winkle. Now, Rip was a descendant of the well-known Dutch Van Winkle family. At least they were well-known in those parts. And he was the heir to all their lands, although now those lands were, in pretty poor condition. All that was left was a little farmhouse and some poor fields. Now, don't misunderstand me. It wasn't through any lack of patience or energy on the part of Rip Van Winkle. Patience? The man was practically a saint. Why, Rip Van Winkle could sit patiently for hours with a fishing pole in his hand, even when no fish were biting, or wander the uplands with his musket all day, searching for something to hunt. With his faithful dog Wolf at his side, he could be seen as far away from home as possible. And energy? Well, Rip was always your man if you needed to harvest crops or build a barn. A neighbor might approach him and say, "Neighbor Van Winkle, I'm finishing building this stone wall. Can you lend me a hand?" And Rip would always reply, "Why, sure I will." Now, after a time, even the neighbor might take a break from this heavy labor, but Rip would just keep right on going. The neighbor might stand there with his wife and say, "This Rip Van Winkle, he's the strongest fella in the area. I couldn't do this without him." "Yes," said the wife, and he's such a sweet-natured man, too, always willing to run little errands. Do you know the other day when you were too busy to help me, he ran down to the general store and got me that thread I wanted. So why do you think his own place is always in such a poor state?" Just then Rip might walk up. He'd say, "Now that's the last stone but one, neighbor Van Hooten. I left the very last one for you, thinking it'd make you feel good to finish the wall yourself. Now I'd better get home now. Come on, Wolf." And Wolf would leap to his feet and bark, "Woof, woof," and dance around Rip, and off they'd go. So you see, that's why his own land was so poor. He was always spending his time helping other people, and he didn't seem to feel it was as important taking care of his own place. And Rip always had time to help the children of the village, make a kite or learn to blow soap bubbles. That's why he was eternally popular with the children and the neighbors. A child might ask him, "Mr. Van Winkle, you said you'd teach me how to bait a hook. Can you do that this afternoon?" Or a little girl might come up to him looking very sad and serious and say, "Mr. Van Winkle, look, my dolly's arm, it's broken." Rip was never too busy. He'd stop, and he'd bend his knees till he was about the height of that little girl, and he'd say, "Well, here, I'll just whittle a brand new arm from this bit of wood. Shouldn't take me too long." For further distraction, there was always the outdoor table next to the village inn. This was the gathering place of all the like-minded fellows in the neighborhood. You could often see Rip there with his friends, the innkeeper, Nicholas Vedder, and the schoolmaster, Derek Van Bommel. If any passing traveler happened to have a newspaper on him, telling about some out-of-date events from the distant world of politics, since news in those days traveled so slowly, the schoolmaster Van Bommel would read aloud to the group and then lead the discussions. "What does it say, Van Bommel? Read that part again where that fellow, what's his name?" "Patrick Henry. Yes, Patrick Henry says that part about the taxes." "But that's not what the king says. Mustn't go against King George." I know, but Lord, how I do hate to pay taxes. Read it over again, Van Bommel." These men could spend hours discussing and debating things that had happened months before in New York City or distant Boston or Philadelphia, or in King George's own city of London, England, which might as well have been on the far side of the moon, it was so far away. And of course, the landlord, Nicholas Vedder, supplied the drinks and the food and the hospitality, so he always had the last word on any subject. With these friends, and in these ways, Rip Van Winkle passed his days. And to tell you the truth, if that had been all, he probably would have been the happiest man in all the 13 colonies. But he wasn't.
For more titles from Jim Weiss and Well-Trained Mind Press, please visit us at jimweiss.com or welltrainedmind.com. Thank you for listening.